The Russo-Japanese War, a war fought between Japan and Russia in the early 20th century. In the previous article, I explained the first battle of the army, the Battle of Yalu River and the Battle of Nanshan. This time, I will explain the Battle of the Yellow Sea between the Lushun fleet and the Allied fleet. Initially, the leaders of the Manchurian army did not plan to attack the Lushun fortress, but to monitor it with some of their troops and put the rest into the battle against the Russian army in Manchuria. However, they began to feel uneasy about leaving the Lushun fortress with nearly 10,000 troops behind them. Therefore, they decided to let the Third Army led by Nogi capture the Lushun fortress. On the other hand, the leaders of the Allied fleet insisted on disposing of the Lushun fleet in Lushun harbor by themselves, and even informed the army that the army was not to interfere in Lushun. As was the case with the Japanese army in the early Showa period, the army and navy of this era were not on good terms and communication was difficult. For this reason, the army had to explain to the navy that this was not an operation for the navy, but for the army's convenience. On March 6, Russia appointed Lieutenant General Makarov, a highly respected general, as the commander of the Lushun fleet. Makarov was an expert in naval tactics, and his books were read by naval personnel all over the world. Togo of the Allied fleet even copied his book and kept it in his room on the battleship Mikasa, his flagship. His predecessor had refused to leave the port of Lushun, but Makarov was different. Makarov returned fire whenever the Japanese navy came near the port of Lushun. This was an exercise to raise the morale of the stagnant fleet as well as to improve the skills of the crew. Makarov only tried to move within the range of the fortress of Port Arthur. He did not want to engage in a major battle unnecessarily. A general staff of the Allied fleet pointed out that the battleship on which Makarov was sailing always behaved regularly and returned to Port Arthur by the same route. Therefore, on April 12, the Allied fleet set mines at the point where Makarov would pass. In the early morning of April 13, a destroyer of the Allied fleet and a destroyer of the Lushun fleet on patrol engaged each other. When Makarov learned of this, he led the main force of the fleet to rescue the destroyer. The Allied fleet also sailed to intercept the Makarov. As usual, Makarov also acted to lure the Allied fleet into range of his shore batteries, and then returned to Port Arthur by the same route. At that time, the battleship on which Makarov was riding came into contact with a mine, sank, and Makarov was killed in action. His successor, Rear Admiral Wijeft, refrained from an aggressive response and remained in Port Arthur. Dumbly, the Allied fleet, which had taken out the enemy general by mine attack, lost battleships by the same method they had used. The Russians planted mines on the route that the Allied fleet in the open sea always took. The Allied fleet possessed 6 main battleships, alternating 3 at a time in fleet movements to the port of Lushun. On May 15, when the combined fleet, including 3 battleships, conducted fleet operations near Lushun harbor as usual, 2 battleships came into contact with mines and sank in a matter of seconds. They lost 30% of their battleships, the mainstay of naval warfare, before the battle could be fought. If this had been on duty on the flagship Mikasa with Togo aboard, he might have died in battle like Makarov. After the Allied fleet lost 2 battleships, the Lushun fleet remained holed up in the port of Lushun. Alexeyev, who was in charge of the fleet, ordered Wijeft, the commander of the fleet, to destroy the Allied fleet as soon as possible and sail to Vladivostok. However, Wijeft had a high opinion of the mobility and leadership of the Allied fleet led by Togo. He judged that the Allied fleet had little chance of victory with his own fleet. The Allied fleet was also unable to find an effective strategy. It was officially decided that the Baltic fleet would come to Japan, and on July 12, the impatient navy formally requested the army to capture Lushun fortress. On August 7, a naval land heavy artillery unit landed in the area occupied by the army and conducted an artillery bombardment of the port of Lushun. This bombardment hit the battleships of the Lushun fleet, and the damage in Lushun harbor was not negligible. Wijeft, who was leading the Lushun fleet by proxy, decided to move the fleet to Vladivostok. Early in the morning of August 10, Wijef departed from Lushun port with the entire Lushun fleet, consisting of 6 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Togo also heard the news of the departure of the Lushun fleet, and sent out the entire combined fleet consisting of 4 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 18 destroyers. At 12:30, the combined fleet spotted the Lushun fleet and went into attack position. First, Togo retreated to lure the fleet further out to sea to prevent it from turning back to Port Lushun. Then, at 1 p.m., the Allied fleet was arranged in a horizontal line to suppress the enemy ship's bow, and the entire force was ready to bombard the front of the enemy ship. This was crossing the T that Togo was synonymous with. Togo had thought that a fierce battle would begin here. However, Wijef was not thinking of fighting from the beginning. All he wanted to do was to escape from Togo and go to Vladivostok. Wijef went in the opposite direction of Togo's progress and tried to escape. In order to prevent this, Togo turned the entire fleet around and tried to intercept the head of the Lushun fleet and reinitiate crossing the T. This is a very time-consuming fleet operation. At 1:30 p.m., Togo reached the front of the Wijef again and began to fire a volley. However, in order to avoid it, Wijef again steered in the opposite direction of Togo's progress. Togo turned the fleet around and followed Wijef to prevent him from doing so. But this time, the fleet action was very delayed. At 15:30, the distance between the two fleets exceeded 3,000 meters, making bombardment impossible. Togo caught up with the Lushun fleet at 17:30. Togo was able to catch up to Wijef because he slowed his fleet action to match the battleship that was hit. This time, the two fleets acted in parallel and exchanged shells. It was at this moment that a miracle occurred. A single shell fired by the Allied fleet struck the command post of the flagship Cesarevich aboard the Wijef. Wijef and the helmsman died instantly, the captain was knocked unconscious, and the command system of the Lushun fleet was completely disabled. The helmsman fell with the rudder wheel rolled to the left, and the rudder machine failed, causing the Cesarevich to turn sharply to the left and plunge into his own line of ships, resulting in the entire ship being scattered. The Lushun fleet was unable to move the fleet in a disciplined manner, and each ship aimed for the port of Lushun on its own. The Allied fleet had an overwhelming advantage in the battle, but they could not sink a single enemy ship, and the battle ended at sunset at 2000 hours. Night raids by destroyers were also conducted, but these also ended in failure. Of the Lushun fleet, 5 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 3 destroyers reached Lushun port. The rest either fled to neutral ports or were sunk by the Allied fleet. The Allied fleet was victorious in this battle, but the element of luck was too strong, as the enemy commander was killed in one blow. There were no battleships that could be sunk, and the leaders of the Allied fleet, including Togo, thoroughly refined their naval tactics based on the lessons of this battle. The Battle of the Sea of Japan can be said to be the result. The Lushun fleet fled to the port of Lushun, but the port of Lushun was not equipped to repair warships and its fighting capability was limited. However, Togo and others believed that the Lushun fleet was still alive and well. Moreover, it was certain that the Lushun fleet would not come out of the port due to this defeat, and the Baltic fleet was also approaching. For this reason, the Navy urged the army to capture Lushun fortress as soon as possible and drive the Lushun fleet out of the port. Thus began Nogi's Fortress Battle of Lushun. If you find it interesting, please subscribe to the channel and click the like button.